cowboy notices something no one else does. The woman at the boarding house wears the same dress every single day, the same faded blue calico, washed every night, put on still damp every morning. She picks up a split tomato from the dirt because she can't afford to waste it. She walks away from help like help always comes with a price. But when a bullet nearly takes his head off and he pulls her behind a water trough to save her life, he sees something in her eyes that stops him cold. Not gratitude, not relief, but the look of a woman who cannot afford to be noticed, because someone is hunting her. There's a man in town with a sketch of her face in his pocket. There's a moneylender on a train heading west who murdered her father and forged documents to own her. And sewn into the hem of that one faded dress is a diamond ring. The only thing standing between her and the man who destroyed everything she ever loved. Now a cowboy with a secret of his own has to decide: walk away or fight for a woman whose entire life fits on a single clothesline. You're listening to Cowboy Chronicles channel, where we tell stories of love, grit, and redemption, set against the untamed beauty of the American West. If your heart belongs to the frontier, you've found your home. This story teaches us that true kindness isn't rescue. It's giving someone the dignity to save themselves. And that the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting. It's choosing to stay when everything inside you screams to run. If that intro already has you hooked, wait until you hear what happens next. Hit like to help this story reach more people. Leave a comment telling me, would you have stayed or run? Share this with someone who needs a reminder that they're stronger than they think. And subscribe with the bell on so you never miss a new tale from the trail.
The bullet buried itself in the post 2 handspans from Adam Thompson's skull, and the first thing he thought about was not dying. It was the woman in the blue dress standing frozen by the clothesline with a wooden pin falling from her fingers. August of 1882 had turned Miles City, Montana territory into something close to hell. The Tongue River ran low in the color of weak coffee. Dust rose from the streets in clouds that stuck to everything: skin and clothes and teeth. The sun beat down on the wooden storefronts and the tin roofs and the backs of men and horses alike, and tempers ran hotter than the air itself. Adam had been working at the Double J Ranch for 3 weeks. Long enough to learn the rhythms of the town, but not long enough to belong. He was leading his horse down Main Street, heading toward the general store for salt and tobacco, when the doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon burst open, and 2 cattlemen stumbled onto the boardwalk with their fists already swinging. He knew trouble when he saw it. He had seen enough of it in his 27 years. But knowing trouble and avoiding it were 2 different skills, and Adam had never been particularly good at the second one. The first man, a thick-necked drover with blood already running from his nose, stumbled backward and reached for his hip. The second man saw the motion and went for his own iron. 2 shots cracked the afternoon air within a heartbeat of each other. One slug punched through the saloon window. The other buried itself in the hitching post right beside Adam's head. He moved without thinking. His body was ahead of his mind, the way it always was when violence broke loose. He crossed the distance between himself and the woman in 3 strides, caught her around the waist, and pulled her down behind the water trough just as a 3rd shot sang through the space where she had been standing. They hit the ground hard. Her vegetable basket flew from her hands and tomatoes rolled into the dust. His body covered hers for one brief second before he rolled off and pulled her to sitting. She was breathing fast, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her eyes wide with shock. And then, those eyes changed. The shock drained out of them, and something harder took its place. Something that looked like anger, or maybe embarrassment, or maybe the particular expression of a woman who could not afford to be rescued, because being rescued meant being noticed. She pulled away from him and got to her knees in the dirt. "I am fine," she said. Her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Thank you, but I am fine." She began gathering her vegetables. A tomato had split open and its red juice stained the dust like blood. She picked it up anyway. Adam saw the motion, and it told him something about her. She could not afford to waste a single tomato. "Let me help you," he said. "I said I am fine." She stood, clutching the basket against her chest, and walked away without looking back. Her spine was straight as a fence post, and her chin was up, and she did not hurry, though he could see her shoulders shaking. Adam watched her go, and that was when the realization landed, quiet and heavy as a stone dropping into still water. He had seen this woman every day for 3 weeks, walking to the market, hanging laundry behind the boarding house, sweeping the porch in the early morning light, and every single time she wore the same dress, the same blue calico, faded unevenly, darker under the arms and lighter at the shoulders where the sun had bleached it. The hem had been let down twice, leaving visible lines across the skirt. The cuffs were frayed to threads, and now there was a new tear along the bottom where she had hit the ground, a rip that showed the white cotton underneath like bone through skin. One dress, washed every night, worn every morning while still damp. He knew this because he had seen it on the clothesline behind the boarding house at dusk, and seen it on her body at dawn, and there was never anything else hanging beside it. Just the one dress, alone on the line. Adam knew poverty. He had grown up inside it like a man grows up inside a cage. His father had been a Kansas farmer who found more comfort in a whiskey bottle than in the soil, and his mother had worn the same skirt until the fabric gave up and fell apart in her hands. He recognized the signs the way a tracker recognizes prints in the mud. The careful way this woman moved, as though her body itself was something she could not afford to break. The way she picked up a split tomato because even ruined food was still food. The way she walked away from help like help was something that always came with a price. The sheriff arrived and broke up what was left of the fight. One of the cattlemen was bleeding from a graze along his ribs. The other had dropped his gun and was sitting in the street with his hands over his face. Nobody was dead. Not this time. Jack Harlan, the foreman at the Double J, had watched the whole thing from across the street. He fell into step beside Adam as they walked toward the livery. "Hell of a reflex," Jack said, "for a man who just pushes cows for a living." Adam did not answer. He flexed his hands and looked down at them. They were steady, perfectly still, and that bothered him more than the bullet had. Normal men shake after a near miss. Their hands tremble and their breath comes short, and their hearts kick in their chests like wild horses. Adam's hands were as steady as if he had been pouring coffee. Because he had done this before, he had moved through gunfire before. He had put himself between danger and another body before. And the last time he had done it, a man had died. He pushed the thought down the way he always did, burying it beneath the surface where it could rot in silence. He untied his horse and swung up into the saddle and rode back toward the Double J with the afternoon sun hammering his shoulders and the image of one blue dress burning in his mind. That evening he rode past the boarding house. He told himself he was just taking the long way back from checking the north fence line. He told himself he was not looking for anything in particular, but he was. The clothesline stretched between 2 wooden posts behind the building, and on it hung a single garment. One dress, blue calico, faded and mended and impossibly alone against the copper sky. It swayed in the hot wind like something trying to escape. Adam reined in his horse and sat there in the fading light, watching that dress move on the line, and something in his chest tightened in a way he did not have words for. Later that night, unable to sleep, he walked his horse past the boarding house one more time. The clothesline was empty now. The dress had been taken down, but in the yard behind the building, a candle burned low and steady, and by its light he could see her, Meredith Baker, sitting on an overturned bucket with the dress spread across her knees, a needle and thread in her hands, stitching the tear he had caused when he pulled her to the ground. Her fingers moved with quick precision, pushing the needle through the worn fabric, pulling the thread tight. But her hands were shaking, and in the candlelight, he could see that her cheeks were wet. She was not just mending, she was crying. Adam turned his horse and rode back to the bunkhouse, and he did not sleep that night. He lay in the dark with his hands behind his head and listened to the wind move across the Montana plain. And he thought about a woman with one dress and no one in the world to notice. But he had noticed, and now he could not stop. Meredith Baker counted her money every night before sleep, not because she enjoyed it, but because if the number dropped below $4, she would have to run again. And this time she had nowhere left to run. The bills and coins lived in a tin box beneath a loose board under her bed in the smallest room at Henderson's boarding house. She kept them organized by denomination, smoothed flat, counted twice. $47.30. 2 years of saving at $6 a month after necessities. 2 years of washing the same dress every night and eating the leftovers from the boarders' plates and never buying anything that was not absolutely essential for survival. Her life ran on a schedule as rigid as railroad time. Up at 4 in the morning to light the stove. Breakfast cooked and served by 6, dishes washed by 7, rooms cleaned by 9. Laundry started by 10, garden tended at noon, supper prepared by 4 in the afternoon, dishes done by 7, and then the quiet hour, the only hour that belonged to her, when she sat in her room and sewed or counted money, or simply breathed. At night, she washed the calico in a basin of cold water, wrung it out, and hung it on the line. She put it on again before dawn, damp against her skin, and wore it through the heat of the day until the sun and her body dried it. The fabric was so thin now that if she held the sleeve to the light, she could see the shadow of her arm through it, like looking through a dusty window. She had not always been poor. The memories came at night mostly, when her defenses were down, and her body was too tired to keep the walls in place. The house on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. 3 stories of red brick with white shutters and a garden in the back where her mother grew roses. A closet in her bedroom with 11 dresses. 11. She could still remember the colors, the green silk for church, the lavender cotton for summer picnics, the deep blue wool for winter. Her mother had taught her to sew on a Singer machine in the parlor, and by 15, Meredith could make a dress from a pattern as well as any seamstress in the city. Her mother had also taught her Chopin. The nocturnes, played in the evening while her father read the newspaper, and the firelight made shadows on the wall. Those were the memories that hurt the worst, because they were the most complete. The sound of the piano, the smell of her father's pipe tobacco, the warmth of a house that was full and safe, and hers. Then her father's business partner disappeared with the accounts, then the debts, then Silas Drummond. She could still see him standing in their parlor with his thin hands folded and his voice soft as a pastor's, a small man in an expensive suit. He had bought her father's debt for pennies on the dollar, and now he owned them. He owned her father's shame and her mother's fear and the house on Chestnut Street and every beautiful thing inside it. But that was not enough. Drummond wanted more. He wanted Meredith. The deal he offered was simple and obscene. "Marry me," he said, "and the debt disappears. Your father keeps his reputation. Your family keeps the house. All it costs is you." Her father had refused. Henry Whitfield was a man broken by failure and debt, but he was not so broken that he would sell his daughter to a moneylender. He told Drummond to leave, and he never came back. 3 weeks later, Henry Whitfield was found dead in his study. The coroner ruled it self-infliction. A pistol in his right hand, a note on the desk, the window standing open to the night air. The funeral was small and attended mostly by creditors. Her mother did not speak for a week, but the details did not fit. Meredith had turned them over in her mind 1,000 times in the 2 years since, worrying at them the way a tongue worries at a broken tooth. The window. Her father had feared drafts his entire adult life, ever since a bout of pneumonia as a child nearly killed him. He never opened windows. Never. Even in the worst summer heat, he kept them latched. The glasses. His reading spectacles were on the left side of the desk. Henry Whitfield was right-handed. He set his glasses on the right side every single time, next to the inkwell, in the same spot for 20 years. The ink. The note was written in black India ink. Her father used only blue. He was particular about it, the way some men are particular about their tobacco or their boots. These details lived in a locked room in Meredith's mind. She visited them sometimes in the dark, turned them over, examined them from every angle, but she never opened the door all the way. She was not ready for what she might find on the other side. Her mother lasted 6 months after the funeral. Typhoid took her in the spring of 1880, quick and merciless. Meredith buried her beside Henry in a cemetery she could no longer afford to maintain. And then she was alone. Drummond came back within a week of the funeral. The debt, he said, transferred to Meredith. The original arrangement still stood. Marry him or face debtor's court. He produced a promissory note with her name on it, claimed she had co-signed her father's obligation. Meredith had never seen the document before in her life. But Drummond owned the judge the way he owned the coroner. She had no money for a lawyer and no family to protect her, and no one in Philadelphia who would stand against a man with Drummond's reach. So she did the only thing she could do. She took her mother's diamond ring, the one piece of jewelry that had not been seized, and sewed it into the hem of her dress. She packed nothing else. She walked out of the boarding house where she had been staying and bought a ticket on the westbound train, and she ran. She ran all the way to Miles City, Montana Territory, where a widow named Clara Henderson gave her a job and a room, and asked no questions about where she came from or why she never smiled. 2 years, one dress, $47.30. And now a cowboy named Adam Thompson had looked at her the way no one had looked at her in all that time. Not with desire, not with pity, with recognition. Like he could see through the faded blue calico to the woman underneath. And what he saw there was something worth seeing. That frightened her more than Drummond ever had. She was thinking about this, lying on her narrow bed in the dark, when she heard hooves on the street below. A single rider. She went to the window and saw a man on a dark horse dismounting at the boarding house hitching post. He was tall and lean and moved with the easy economy of someone accustomed to hard country. She could not see his face in the darkness. The front door opened and closed. Clara Henderson's voice, low and professional, offered the last available room. The stranger's voice was quiet, clipped, and gave nothing away. He signed the register. His boots climbed the stairs. The next morning, Meredith carried fresh linens to his room. The door was open. He was not there. She set the towels on the washstand and turned to leave. Then she saw it. On the nightstand, folded once, a piece of paper with a pencil sketch. She should not have looked. She knew she should not have looked. But something about the way it was placed, angled toward the bed as though its owner studied it before sleep, drew her eye. She picked it up, unfolded it, and her blood went cold. It was a portrait, her own face, done in quick, confident strokes by someone who had either seen her in person or worked from a very good description. Her eyes, her jaw, the way her hair fell. Even the faded collar of the blue calico was rendered with care. She put the paper back exactly where she had found it and walked out of the room on legs that felt like water. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall and breathed. The man's name, according to the register downstairs, was Virgil Pike. He had come a long way to find her. Adam did not believe in gut feelings. He believed in what his eyes told him. And his eyes were telling him that Meredith Baker's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the breakfast tray when she served the new guest at table 3. He had come to the boarding house that morning with the excuse of buying a meal. One of Clara Henderson's famous breakfasts, eggs and biscuits and gravy thick enough to patch a roof. But the food was secondary. He wanted to see Meredith, and he was not skilled enough at deception to pretend otherwise. She moved through the dining room with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had served 1,000 breakfasts, filling coffee cups and laying plates and clearing crumbs without being asked. But her rhythm was off this morning. There was a stiffness in her shoulders and a watchfulness in her eyes that had not been there before. Adam sat near the window and watched the room. 12 boarders at various tables, most of them cattlemen or railroad workers passing through. Clara Henderson presiding over the kitchen with her usual iron authority. And at table 3, alone, the new guest. Adam studied him the way he studied cattle or horses or weather, looking for the details that told the real story. The man sat with his back to the wall, which told Adam he did not like being approached from behind. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the room in small, precise arcs. His right hand rested on the table near his coffee cup, but it was positioned in a way that would allow him to reach his hip in less than a second. He wore a dark coat despite the heat, which meant he was carrying something under it that he did not want seen. This was not a drifter. This was not a cattleman or a soldier or a drummer selling wares from town to town. This was a hunter. And from the way Meredith's hands shook every time she came within 3 feet of his table, Adam was fairly certain he knew what the man was hunting. The stranger looked up when Meredith reached his table with the coffee pot. He studied her face for a moment. Then he said something that made Adam's hand tighten around his own cup. "You remind me of someone." Meredith froze. The coffee pot hovered above his cup, tilted but not pouring. The man added, almost gently, "My daughter. She would be about your age now." Then his face closed like a door shutting, and he went back to his eggs. Meredith poured the coffee and moved away without a word. But Adam saw the way her jaw clenched and the way she pressed her lips together as though holding something back. Fear, maybe, or recognition. After breakfast, Adam found a reason to linger. He offered to haul water from the pump for Clara, a chore that took him past the back porch where Meredith was scrubbing pots. She looked up when he set the bucket down, and for a moment their eyes met, and he saw the full weight of whatever she was carrying. "That man at table 3, Adam said quietly. "Does he frighten you?" Meredith's expression shuddered. "I do not know what you mean. Your hands were shaking when you served him." It was a heavy tray. She went back to scrubbing. Adam crouched down beside the porch so their faces were level. "Miss Baker, I am not asking to pry. I am asking because I saw the way he watched you. And I have seen men watch things they are hunting, and the look is the same." Meredith stopped scrubbing. She did not look at him. She stared at the pot in her hands as though it contained something she was trying to read. "If you need help," Adam said, "I am at the Double J any hour, day or night." She said nothing. He stood and carried the water inside and did not push further. That afternoon, Adam went to Whitmore's general store for supplies. The old shopkeeper was a gossip, but a reliable one, the kind of man who heard everything and shared it only when he thought it mattered. Adam bought salt and tobacco and a new length of rope. And as Whitmore tallied the bill, Adam asked as casually as he could manage about the new boarder at Henderson's place. Whitmore leaned across the counter and lowered his voice. "Fellow named Pike, been asking around about a young woman from back east. Dark hair, early 20s, come to town maybe a year or 2 ago. Said he was looking for a debtor's daughter who ran off with collateral. What did you tell him?" "I told him Miles City has a lot of women, and I do not keep track of them." Which is true enough. Whitmore paused. "But he did not strike me as a man who gives up easy. Watch yourself, son. And watch that girl." The warning settled into Adam's bones like a cold he could not shake. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. The heat that had been building for weeks pressed down on the town like a hand. Horses stamped and pulled at their ropes. Dogs crawled under porches and whimpered. Every old rancher in Miles City looked at the sky and said the same thing. Storm coming. A bad one. It hit just before supper time. The wind came first, slamming into Miles City from the northwest like a freight train made of dust and fury. Adam was in town returning supplies to his saddlebag when the first gust tore a sign off the front of the barber shop and sent it spinning down the street like a playing card. He grabbed his horse and got the animal into the livery just as the rain arrived. Not a gentle rain, but a wall of water that turned the street into a river in seconds. He ran to the boarding house. Clara Henderson was in the front room trying to shutter the windows against the wind. Two boarders were helping her, but the wind was winning. Adam grabbed a loose shutter and hauled it into place, driving nails with a hammer from Clara's toolbox, while rain sprayed through every gap and seam. The front door ripped free of its top hinge and swung inward with a crash. Adam caught it and braced it with his shoulder. Meredith appeared from the kitchen carrying towels to soak up the water pouring across the floor. Their eyes met over the chaos, and Adam saw something that surprised him. Not fear, determination. She was a woman accustomed to disaster. Then the ceiling beam in the storeroom shifted. The sound was deep and wooden and wrong, a groan that came from the bones of the building itself. Adam and Meredith were closest to the storeroom door. He grabbed her arm and pulled her through just as a section of the ceiling gave way behind them, dropping plaster and timber into the hallway they had been standing in. The storeroom door jammed shut, dust and darkness. The sound of the storm hammering the building like a living thing trying to get in. 15 minutes. That was how long they were trapped. In the blackness, Adam could hear Meredith breathing. Fast at first, almost panting, and then slower as she forced herself to calm down. He could feel the heat of her body near his in the close dark space. Then her hand found his. She grabbed it and held on and did not let go. He could feel her pulse hammering against his palm, rapid as a rabbit's heart. Her fingers were slender and strong and calloused from work, and they held his hand with a grip that said she was terrified. But she was choosing to hold on rather than fall apart. He did not speak. He did not need to. He just held her hand and waited, and felt the storm rage around them, and felt this woman's heartbeat against his skin, and knew with a certainty that went beyond words that something had changed between them. When the storm passed and the other boarders pried the storeroom door open, light flooded in and Meredith dropped his hand like it had burned her. She stepped back, straightened her dress, smoothed her hair. "I am sorry," she said. "I should not have done that." "Do not apologize for that," Adam said. "Do not ever apologize for that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and went back to the kitchen to check on supper. The storm passed, but it left damage behind. A section of the boarding house roof needed patching. The front door hung crooked. Two windows were cracked. Within an hour, people from town began arriving with supplies and offers of help, the way they always did in small places where survival depended on neighbors. Eleanor Price was among them. She owned the fabric and dressmaking shop on 2nd Street, the only one in Miles City. She brought scraps of canvas for patching and a bolt of cheap muslin for covering the broken windows. She was a striking woman, tall and fair-haired, with the kind of practical beauty that came from hard work and good bones rather than from finery. She saw Adam and her face brightened. She touched his arm in a way that was familiar without being inappropriate, and said she hoped he would stop by her shop sometime. She had fabric that would make excellent shirts for a working man. Adam thanked her and said he might, and he meant nothing by it, but when he glanced up at the second-floor windows of the boarding house, he saw Meredith watching. That evening, Adam asked Clara Henderson for permission to walk with Meredith on Sunday. Clara studied him with those sharp eyes that did not miss much. "Meredith is a good woman, who has had more than her share of hardship. If you are not serious in your intentions, I would rather you say so now and save everyone the trouble. I cannot say where this will lead, Mrs. Henderson, but I can tell you that I will treat her with respect. That is a promise." Clara nodded slowly. Then she added in a lower voice, "There is something you should know. That Pike fellow asked me about Meredith this morning. I told him I did not know anyone by that description, but he will ask again. And he does not strike me as a man who asks 3 times. Adam felt the cold settle deeper. That night he lay in his bunk at the Double J and stared at the ceiling. The bunkhouse was quiet except for the sounds of men sleeping and the wind moving through the grass outside. In the next bunk, Jack Harlan rolled over and said into the dark, "You are going to get tangled up with that girl, aren't you?" It was not a question. "I am already tangled," Adam said. "Then you had better tell her what you are before someone else does." Adam said nothing. He knew Jack was right. He also knew he was not ready. Meredith had prepared 3 sentences to say when Adam arrived. Safe sentences, polite sentences, sentences that revealed nothing about the storm inside her chest. But when she saw him standing on the porch that Sunday morning with his hair still damp from washing and his cleanest shirt buttoned wrong at the collar, every rehearsed word evaporated like river mist. "Good morning, Miss Baker," he said and took off his hat. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. You have buttoned your collar wrong." He looked down. Color rose in his face, which was tanned and angular, and had probably never blushed in a saloon or a cattle pen, but was blushing now on Clara Henderson's front porch. He fixed the button with clumsy fingers, and Meredith felt something crack open inside her chest, something she had spent 2 years walling shut. Clara appeared in the doorway, inspected Adam with the thoroughness of a woman evaluating livestock at auction, and pronounced her terms. 1 hour. Stay where people can see you, and if you bring her back 1 minute late, I will assume the worst and respond accordingly." "Yes, ma'am." They walked. The path along the Tongue River was shaded by cottonwoods that had been old when the first trappers came through. Afternoon sun slanted gold through the leaves and made patterns on the water. The smell was sage and dust and the mineral sweetness of river mud. Fish jumped in the shallows. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with its wings held wide and still. Adam pointed it out. "That bird has the right idea. Let the wind do the work." "Is that your philosophy?" Meredith asked. "Let the wind carry you?" "It has been for a long time." He paused. "But I'm getting tired of drifting." They walked in silence for a while. The path wound along the riverbank past willow thickets and gravel bars. On one bar, bleached white by the sun, lay the carcass of a longhorn. Its ribs rose from the sand like the hull of a wrecked ship. Meredith stopped and stared at it. "The drought," Adam said. "River got too low for drinking. The weak ones did not make it." Beauty and death sharing the same frame. That was Montana. That was the whole West. You could not look at the sky without seeing both. They walked on, and the path curved back toward town. As they passed the edge of the main street, Meredith saw something that stopped her cold. In the town square, standing on its rough timber legs, was a gallows. A noose hung from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the breeze. No one had bothered to take it down after the hanging last week. Meredith had never seen a gallows before. She had read about them. She had heard about the hanging, a cattle thief caught with someone else's brand on a dozen head. But seeing the structure itself, the raw wood, the noose, the trap door, was different from reading about it. It made death real in a way that words on a page could not. She turned to Adam and found him staring at the gallows with an expression she could not read. His jaw was tight. His eyes were fixed on the noose with a concentration that seemed to go beyond casual observation. Something in the set of his shoulders reminded her of a man facing a mirror he did not want to look into. She did not understand the source of his tension, but she felt it, and without thinking she reached over and took his arm. The first time she had initiated contact. His muscle was hard beneath her fingers, tense as braided rope. She felt him flinch at her touch, then relax, then lean almost imperceptibly into it. Neither of them acknowledged it. Both of them felt it. "Tell me about Kansas," she said, gently steering him away from whatever dark place the gallows had taken him. He told her, piece by piece, with the careful editing of a man who has practiced his own story until the dangerous parts are smooth enough to skip over. A farm outside of Ellsworth, flat land and big sky and soil that broke your back and your spirit in equal measure. A father who found more solace in whiskey than in the fields. A mother who held the family together with her bare hands until her hands gave out. "She died when I was 14, Adam said. Just worn down. The doctor said it was her heart, but I think it was everything else that killed her first, and her heart just finally agreed." "And your father?" "Drank himself to death when I was 15. I buried him next to her, and I left, and I have not been back." He told her about cattle drives, about sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled flour, about rivers that could kill a man in spring flood and dry to nothing by August, about the loneliness of months on the trail with nothing but cattle and cowboys and the endless grass. He stopped the story at age 19. Meredith noticed the gap the way a seamstress notices a skipped stitch. Something had happened at 19 that he was not telling her. But she understood about gaps. She had her own. "What about you?" he asked. "Where did you come from before Miles City?" She told him about Philadelphia, the good parts. Her father's kindness and his terrible jokes, her mother's music, the garden on Chestnut Street and the roses that bloomed every June, the closet with 11 dresses, and how her mother let her choose the fabric for each one. She stopped the story before the debts, before Drummond, before the study with the open window. Adam noticed the gap. She could see it in his eyes. But he did not push, and she loved him a little for that. Not loved, she corrected herself, appreciated. She appreciated him for that. On the path home, they found the yellow dog. Meredith had been feeding the stray for months, leaving scraps behind the boarding house in a chipped bowl she had rescued from Clara's discard pile. The dog was a scrappy thing, all ribs and spirit, with matted yellow fur and one torn ear, and the wary eyes of a creature that had been kicked more than petted. Today the dog was limping. It lay in the shade of a cottonwood with its front paw held off the ground, whimpering softly. Meredith knelt in the dirt without hesitation. Her blue calico soaked up mud and river water at the knees, but she did not seem to notice or care. She took the paw gently and found the thorn, a long mesquite spine driven deep into the pad. "Easy," she murmured. "Easy now. I know it hurts." "I know. Hold still for me." She worked the thorn free with steady fingers. The dog whimpered and licked her wrist, and then scrambled up and licked her face too, tail wagging furiously, as though the pain was already forgotten and only the kindness remained. Adam watched her. He watched her hands, calloused and strong, handling the injured paw with the same precision she brought to her sewing. He watched her face, soft with concern, all the walls and defenses stripped away in this unguarded moment, with an animal that needed her. And something turned over inside him, heavy and permanent, like a key in a lock. "This is the woman I want," he thought, and immediately after, "This is the woman I have no right to want, not with what I have done." They walked back to the boarding house slowly, the dog trotting beside them with its tail held high. When they reached the porch, Pike was sitting in the rocking chair, whittling a piece of pine into a shape Adam could not identify. He looked up as they approached, and his eyes settled on Meredith. "Miss Baker," he said. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. "Where did you say you were from?" "I did not," Meredith said. Pike nodded slowly, returned to his whittling, but the question hung in the air between them like smoke after a gunshot. Adam walked Meredith to the door. "Same time next Sunday?" he asked. "I would like that," she said. And the way she said it, quiet and careful, like a woman picking up something fragile, made his chest ache. That evening after dark, Meredith locked her bedroom door and sat on the edge of her bed. She reached down and felt along the hem of her blue calico dress until her fingers found the small, hard lump, the diamond ring, still there, still safe. "Just a few more months," she whispered. A few more months of saving, and she would have enough to leave Miles City and start over somewhere Drummond could never find her. Maybe California. Maybe Oregon. Somewhere far away from everything she had lost. But even as she said it, the words felt hollow. Because for the first time in 2 years, she was not entirely sure she wanted to leave. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Someone stopped, stood there. She could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, on the other side of the thin wood. And she could smell something drifting through the gap beneath the door. Tobacco smoke. Hand rolled, A specific blend, the kind that Virgil Pike smoked at the breakfast table every morning. She sat perfectly still on the bed with her hand pressed against the ring in her hem, and her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. After a long moment, the footsteps moved on. A door opened and closed down the hall. Silence. Meredith did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and her hand on the hem of her dress, and she thought about running. She always thought about running. It was the only skill she had left. But tonight, for the first time, she also thought about staying. The idea came to Adam at 2 in the morning while he was mending a saddle girth by lantern light in the Double J bunkhouse. He had been staring at the old leather, punching new holes and threading new lacing, when he realized he had been trying to fix the wrong thing. It was not leather that needed mending. It was a woman's dignity that needed preserving. He could not simply buy Meredith a dress. A woman who washed and wore the same calico every day rather than accept charity was not going to accept a gift from a cowboy she had walked with twice. The pride that kept her in that dress was the same pride that kept her upright and functioning and human, and if he violated it, he would lose whatever fragile trust he had earned. He needed a way to give her what she needed while letting her believe she had earned it. The plan assembled itself in pieces over the next few hours, like a puzzle coming together in the dark. By dawn, Adam had it figured. He saddled his horse and rode into Miles City before breakfast. Clara Henderson was in the kitchen, rolling biscuit dough with the efficient violence of a woman who had been doing it for 30 years. Meredith was not yet up. Adam sat at the kitchen table and laid out his proposition. "I need 3 work shirts made," he said. "Mine are getting worn out, and I would rather have something well-made that will last than cheap store-bought goods that fall apart in 6 months. I know Miss Baker can sew. I am willing to pay in fabric and thread rather than money. She makes the shirts, keeps any leftover fabric as part of her compensation. It is a job, not charity." Clara stopped rolling. She studied him for a long time with those sharp gray eyes that saw through pretense the way sunlight sees through gauze. "That is a clever plan, Mr. Thompson. It is just business, ma'am. It is not just business, and we both know it. But it might work, if you are careful." She resumed rolling, pressing the dough flat with practiced strokes. "I will tell you something about Meredith that she does not advertise. She is a far better seamstress than she lets on. She was trained in Philadelphia by someone who knew the craft. She hides it because fine needlework suggests a background she would rather not explain. Why are you telling me this? Because if she makes your shirts, and they are excellent, which they will be, then the transaction is legitimate. She is providing genuine skill for fair payment. That protects her pride." Clara fixed him with a look. "But listen to me carefully. If she discovers this is a scheme, she will never trust you again. Not because of the lie, but because she will think every kindness you have shown her was just pity wearing a mask. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Then go ask her yourself. She is probably burning holes in the ceiling with her curiosity about what we have been whispering about." Adam found Meredith in the hallway. Not quite eavesdropping, but positioned in a way that suggested she had been doing exactly that. She looked at him with an expression that was part suspicion and part something else he could not name. "I have a business proposition for you," he said. Her expression closed immediately, like shutters slamming against a storm. "Hear me out," he said. "This is not charity. I need 3 work shirts. Mine are getting thin, and I would rather pay someone who does quality work than buy cheap goods from a catalog. Mrs. Henderson tells me you can sew. I can sew well enough. I want to pay you in fabric and thread rather than cash. You pick out the material, make the shirts to my measurements, and keep any excess fabric as part of your compensation. It is a straightforward job." He watched her process this. He could practically see the gears turning behind those creek-water eyes, looking for the trap, the hidden charity, the strings attached. 3 shirts, she said. You pay fair price for fabric and labor. Not 1 penny extra. If I find out you have padded this arrangement in any way, I will return everything. Agreed. And I choose the fabric. Of course. She studied him for another moment, then nodded once. When do you need them? No rush. Whenever you have time. Saturday. We will go to the general store on Saturday. Saturday came with clear skies and a heat that was beginning to show the first cracks of autumn. Adam met Meredith at 10 in the morning outside Whitmore's general store. He noticed she had done something different with her hair, pulled it back with a ribbon he had not seen before, and the effect softened her face in a way that made his breath catch. They went inside. The store smelled of tobacco and dried beans and new rope and the particular warm, dusty scent of bolted fabric. Whitmore kept the fabric along the back wall, rolls of cotton and muslin and calico stacked floor to ceiling in a display that was more practical than decorative. Meredith's fingers went to the bolts immediately. She touched a brown cotton, sturdy and plain. This would make good work shirts, she said. Durable, stands up to washing. What about that one? Adam pointed to a bolt of dark blue chambray, softer and finer than the brown. That is more expensive. But it is better quality, right? It will last longer. Better value for the money. She considered this with the seriousness of a woman for whom every purchase was a calculation of survival. Then she nodded. Yes, chambray is very durable. Good weight for work shirts. Not too heavy, not too light. Then we will take that one. She measured the bolt against her arm and asked Adam questions about his height and shoulder width that made him feel oddly exposed, like being measured for a coffin, except considerably more pleasant. She calculated quickly in her head. For 3 shirts with practice material, you would need about 12 yards. Let us take 15, Adam said. Better to have extra than come up short. 15 is too much. I am a big man, and you said yourself you need practice material to get the fit right. 15 yards, Miss Baker. Old Whitmore, who had been watching this transaction with the knowing expression of a man who has sold fabric to courting couples before, cleared his throat. If you are buying 15 yards, I can offer a discount. 17 yards for the price of 15. That way you are certain to have enough. Adam could have kissed the old shopkeeper. That sounds perfect. They added thread, buttons, and bias tape for the seams. Meredith chose each item with the focused attention of a woman who understood materials and respected them. When she held the blue chambray up to the light, testing the weave, her hands were steady and sure. This was a woman in her element, doing something she was born to do, and the transformation was remarkable. The wariness that usually clouded her face was gone, replaced by a quiet competence that Adam found more attractive than any smile. The total came to nearly a month of Adam's wages. He paid without flinching. Whitmore wrapped everything in brown paper and twine. As Adam lifted the package off the counter, Whitmore leaned close and said in a voice meant only for him, "That Pike fellow was in here again yesterday. Asked about Miss Baker by description. I told him nothing. But you should know he is not giving up." Adam nodded and carried the package out into the sunshine. On the sidewalk, Meredith clutched the package against her chest. Her eyes were bright. Adam realized with a start that she was happy. Genuinely, unguardedly happy. Maybe for the first time since he had known her. 17 yards of good fabric represented something more than material. It represented possibility. "When do you need the shirts finished?" she asked. "Whenever you have time. I know you are busy with the boarding house. I can work on them in the evenings. I will take your measurements tomorrow after church." "I will look forward to it," Adam said. And he meant far more than the measurements. Over the next 2 weeks, Meredith sewed. She worked on Adam's shirts every evening after her boarding house duties were done, sitting near the lamp in her room with the chambray spread across her lap and a needle flashing in her fingers. The stitches were tiny and precise, far better than what any casual seamstress could produce. Clara Henderson had been right. Meredith had been trained and trained well. Each evening as she sewed, she thought about the man whose shape she was building in cloth, the width of his shoulders, the length of his arms, the way his neck met his collar. She had measured him with a tape while standing close enough to smell the soap he used, something with pine in it, and the experience had left her flustered in a way she did not want to examine. She was falling, she knew it. Every Sunday walk, every stolen conversation, every moment when their eyes met across a crowded room and held. She was falling for a cowboy who noticed she wore the same dress every day and cared enough to do something about it without making her feel small. And that terrified her, because falling meant staying, and staying meant Drummond could find her. One evening, Pike passed her open door and stopped. She looked up from her sewing, needle poised, heart suddenly racing. He stood in the doorway and studied the fabric in her hands. "That is fine work," he said. His voice was quiet, almost wistful. "My wife used to sew like that, before she passed." Then he walked on. Meredith stared at the empty doorway, unsettled not by threat, but by the unexpected humanity of the moment. A bounty hunter talking about his dead wife's sewing. A hard man momentarily softened by memory. It did not fit the picture she had built of him, and things that did not fit made her nervous. That night, after finishing a sleeve, Meredith did what she did every night. She reached down to the hem of her blue calico dress and felt for the diamond ring. Her fingers found cloth, just cloth. The small, hard lump that had been there every night for 2 years was gone. She tore the hem open. Nothing. She searched the floor, the bed, the wash basin, the corners of the room. She pulled the mattress off the frame. She emptied her tin box and counted the money twice, even though money was not what she was looking for. She went through every pocket and fold and seam of every item she owned. The ring was gone. She sat on the edge of her stripped bed, holding the dress with the empty hem, and tried to think clearly through the roaring in her ears. When had she last checked? 2 nights ago. It had been there 2 nights ago. What had happened since then? Yesterday morning. The dress had been on the clothesline. She had left it there while she served breakfast. When she went to retrieve it, it was not on the line. It was in the laundry room, neatly folded. She had assumed Clara had taken it down, but Clara never touched the boarder's laundry. Someone had taken the dress off the line, searched the hem, found the ring, and put the dress back where Meredith would find it without suspicion. Pike. It had to be Pike. He had been asking questions for weeks. He had the sketch of her face. He knew who she was, or suspected strongly enough that the ring would confirm it. Her first instinct was the one she had trained into herself for 2 years. Run. Tonight. Now. Do not pack. Do not explain. Just go. She stood and reached for her coat. Then her eyes fell on the chair by the window where Adam's half-finished shirt was draped over the back. Blue chambray, precise stitches. The shape of his shoulders ghosted in the fabric. She could not leave without finishing what she had promised. The realization hit her with a force that stole her breath. She could not leave because of a shirt, because of a promise she had made to a man she barely knew. Because the thought of disappearing without a word, of Adam coming to the boarding house on Sunday and finding her gone, of him never knowing what had happened or why, was worse than anything Drummond could do to her. She was not staying for a shirt. She was staying for him. And that frightened her more than Pike, more than Drummond, more than the empty hem of a dress that had been her only security for 2 years. 3 things happened on the same Tuesday in October that changed the course of everything. Eleanor Price made a deal she could not undo. Adam Thompson nearly became the man he had spent 8 years trying to bury, and a yellow dog died for knowing the wrong woman. Eleanor Price stood in her shop at 7 in the morning, surrounded by bolts of fabric and the smell of new cotton, and stared at the letter in her hands. The handwriting was neat and businesslike. The message was not. 3 months back rent. Pay by Friday or the shop would be boarded up and the inventory seized. Signed by Hargrove, the man who owned half the commercial property in Miles City. The man who, as Eleanor had recently learned, worked for a Philadelphia moneylender named Silas Drummond. Eleanor had built her shop from nothing. She had come to Miles City 5 years ago with $60 and a sewing machine and had turned it into the only dressmaking establishment between Billings and Glendive. She made wedding dresses and curtains and fancy shirts for ranchers' wives. She repaired cavalry uniforms for the soldiers at Fort Keogh. She was 26 years old and she had never asked anyone for anything. But 3 months of slow business and a landlord who had doubled the rent without warning had put her against a wall she could not climb. Pike came to her shop that same morning. He did not browse the fabric or ask about tailoring. He sat down in the chair by the window and got straight to the point. "I need information about a woman staying at Henderson's boarding house. Calls herself Meredith Baker, dark hair, early 20s. I believe you know her by sight." "I know most people in this town by sight." "Then you will know that she has been spending time with a cowboy from the Double J, a man named Adam Thompson." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. She had watched Adam walk with Meredith along the river on Sundays. She had seen the way he looked at the girl in the faded blue dress, as though she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Eleanor had wanted him to look at her that way. He never had. "What do you want?" she asked. "Confirm her identity. Tell me her movements, where she goes, who she talks to, when she leaves the boarding house." Pike placed a stack of bills on the counter. "This covers your back rent and 3 months forward. There will be more when the job is done." Eleanor looked at the money. She looked at the letter from Hargrove. She looked at the sewing machine that was the only valuable thing she owned in the world. "Why are you looking for her?" "She owes a debt. My employer wants it settled." "And if I say no?" Pike stood. "Then you say no. I do not threaten women, Miss Price. But Hargrove does. And he takes his orders from the same man I do." After Pike left, Eleanor sat alone in her shop for a long time. She thought about Meredith Baker in her single faded dress, working herself to bone at the boarding house for $6 a month. She thought about Adam Thompson carrying Meredith's vegetable basket like it was made of gold. She thought about the fact that she, Eleanor, was about to betray a woman she barely knew for the price of rent. She took the money, and then she wrote a note. The note was not for Pike, it was for Adam. She tucked it into an envelope and asked one of the town boys to deliver it to the Double J Ranch. The note said, "The man called Pike is hunting Miss Baker. He has paid me to watch her. I have told him nothing yet, but I cannot hold out long. Hargrove owns my building and Hargrove works for Drummond. I need help or I need to save myself. You decide which." She signed it with just her initial, E. That afternoon, Adam rode into Miles City with the note burning a hole in his shirt pocket and rage building in his chest like pressure in a boiler. He did not go to Eleanor. He went to the Silver Dollar Saloon. Pike was at the bar drinking water. He did not drink whiskey either, Adam noticed. A sober hunter, a careful one. Adam walked up to him. He meant to be calm. He meant to be controlled. He meant to handle this the way a grown man handles things, with words and reason, and the kind of cold authority that made violence unnecessary. Instead, the moment Pike turned and Adam saw the man's face, something snapped. He grabbed Pike by the collar of his coat and slammed him against the bar hard enough to rattle every glass on the shelf. Pike's hand went for his belt, but Adam already had his forearm across the man's throat, pressing him backward over the bar rail. "Stay away from her," Adam said. His voice was low and rough and did not sound like his own. Pike did not struggle. He did not show fear. He looked at Adam with those cold tracker's eyes and said very quietly, "There he is. I was wondering when you would show up." The words hit Adam like cold water. There he is. As if Pike had been waiting for the real Adam to surface. As if the cowboy was just a costume and Pike had always known what was underneath. For 3 seconds, Adam Calloway was back. The 19-year-old who had pulled a trigger in Kansas and watched a man fall. The boy with blood on his hands and panic in his heart. The killer who ran. Then Jack Harlan's hands were on Adam's shoulders, pulling him backward. "Easy, partner, easy. This is not the place." Adam let go. Pike straightened his collar with no apparent urgency, picked up his water glass, and took a drink. "You should keep better control of your cowboy," Pike said to Jack. "And you should keep better company than whoever is paying you to terrorize young women," Jack replied evenly. "Come on, Adam, let us go." In the alley behind the saloon, Adam leaned against the wall and shook. His hands trembled. His whole body trembled. He stared at his palms as though they belonged to someone else. "That was not about the girl," Jack said quietly. "That was about you. And you need to figure out which one scares you more." Adam closed his eyes and breathed until the shaking stopped. 3 seconds. He had been 3 seconds from becoming the man he had spent 8 years running from. 3 seconds from proving that violence was the only language he truly spoke. Later, as Adam was saddling his horse to leave town, Pike found him at the livery. Adam tensed, but Pike made no aggressive move. He just stood in the doorway and said something strange. 12 years I have done this work. This is the first time a client lied to me about why." Adam turned. "What does that mean?" "It means I am asking questions that Drummond does not want asked. It means the story he told me does not hold together the way it should." Pike paused. "You have a temper, Thompson, or whatever your real name is, but you also have instincts. So do I. And my instincts are telling me that this job is not what I was told it was." He walked away without further explanation. Adam watched him go, confused and wary, but with something like hope flickering at the edges of his exhaustion. That night, someone killed the yellow dog. Meredith found it at dawn, hanging from the boarding house fence by a rope around its neck. A note was nailed to the fence post beneath it, written in a hand she did not recognize. The note said, "Drummond arrives in 10 days." She stood in the gray morning light and looked at the dog she had fed for months. The scrappy, fearless, affectionate creature that had waited for her scraps every evening and licked her fingers, and followed her to the garden and slept outside her window. She did not scream. She did not cry. She cut the rope with a kitchen knife, wrapped the dog in a flour sack, and carried it behind the garden. She dug a hole with a spade, placed the body inside, and covered it with earth. She patted the mound flat and placed a stone on top. Then she went inside, washed her hands, put on her apron, and served breakfast to 12 boarders with steady hands and a face made of stone. That morning, the clothesline behind the boarding house was empty. Meredith had taken her dress inside. She was packing. Clara Henderson found her after supper. One small bag on the bed. The half-finished chambray shirt folded on top. Nothing else. "If you leave tonight," Clara said, sitting on the bed, "he wins. Drummond, Pike, whoever left that message. They win because they made you run again." "Running is the only thing that has kept me alive." "That was true once," Clara said. "It is not true anymore." Meredith looked at the older woman. Clara's face was lined by years of sun and wind and loss, but her eyes were steady and fierce. The eyes of a woman who knew about running and had chosen to stand still. "You do not know what he is capable of," Meredith said. "I know exactly what he is capable of," Clara said, and her voice went hard as iron. "His man Hargrove killed my husband over 40 acres of grazing land 10 years ago. I know Drummond. I know what he does to people who owe him. And I know that running does not make it stop. It just delays the reckoning." Meredith sat down slowly. "I did not know about your husband. No one does. I have been silent for 10 years because I was afraid. But I am tired of being afraid, Meredith. And I think you are too." The clothesline remained empty, but the bag stayed on the bed, unpacked. Adam received the message at first light, a folded scrap of paper pinned to the double J gate in Clara Henderson's trembling handwriting. 2 words. "Come now." He did not saddle his horse. He threw a blanket across its back, grabbed a fistful of mane, and rode bareback through the gray dawn at a gallop that ate up the 7 miles between the ranch and town in less than 20 minutes. Jack Harlan, roused by the sound of hooves, followed 5 minutes behind. He found Meredith in her room at the boarding house. The bag was on the bed. The shirt was on top. Clara stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and her expression torn between fury and fear. "She is leaving," Clara said. I am sitting right here, Meredith said. Do not talk about me as though I am not. Adam knelt beside the bed so his face was level with hers. Her eyes were dry and hard and the color of creek water over stone. Tell me, he said. Whatever it is, tell me. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told him. Not everything. Not the details about her father's death or the suspicions she kept locked away. But the broad strokes, Drummond, the debt, the forced marriage proposal, the ring sewn into her hem, the flight west, the 2 years of hiding under a borrowed name. And now someone has taken the ring, she said. Pike. It had to be Pike. He has been asking about me for weeks. He has a drawing of my face, and now he has the proof he needed to send for Drummond. How long? 10 days. That is what the note said. 10 days. Adam felt the ground shift beneath him. He had known Meredith was hiding something. He had suspected it was serious. But hearing it laid out, the debt and the flight, and the stolen ring, and the countdown, the reality of her situation hit him with a force that drove the breath from his lungs. He could let her go. That would be the safe choice. No confrontation with Pike, no risk of his own past surfacing. He could ride back to the Double J and mend fences and push cattle and pretend that the woman with one dress had never happened. Jack Harlan arrived while Adam was still kneeling by the bed. Jack took one look at the scene and understood. He leaned against the doorframe and said, in the quiet voice he used when things were serious, "You cannot save her without facing yourself first, Adam. You know that." "I know." "Then tell her." "Not yet." "When?" Adam did not answer. He stood and looked at Meredith and said, "You are not leaving, and I am not letting anyone take you." "You do not understand what you are getting into," she said. "I do not care." "You should, probably, but I am not known for good sense." Together with Jack and Clara, they formed a plan, simple and practical. Meredith would stay at the boarding house but never be alone. Clara would keep watch during the day. Jack would recruit 2 trusted hands from the Double J to take shifts in the evenings. And Adam would confront Pike directly, not with fists this time, with words. He found Pike at dawn the next morning, down at the riverbank, crouched by the water's edge, washing his face. The Tongue River was low but moving, brown water sliding over smooth stones. Pike looked up at the sound of Adam's boots on the gravel and did not seem surprised. "I was wondering when you would come," Pike said. "Leave Miles City," Adam said. Pike stood slowly, drying his hands on his pants. "I have a contract. Drummond pays me to bring the girl back or recover his property. The ring? And the girl. He has a promissory note with her name on it. She co-signed her father's debt. She ran, and she took collateral. Legally, I am within rights. A usurer's note on a dead man's debt does not transfer to his daughter, not in any territory I have ridden through." Pike went still. He studied Adam with those flat hunter's eyes, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or reevaluation. "You talk like a man who knows the law," Pike said, "or like a man who has run from it." The sentence hit Adam like a fist to the gut. He kept his face still, but his pulse jumped, and he knew Pike saw it. "I sent the ring to Drummond 3 days ago," Pike said. "Proof I found her. He's already on his way. Should be here inside a week." Adam's stomach dropped. "You sent it already." "I did my job, but I have been doing this long enough to know when a story does not hold." Pike picked up a stone and turned it in his fingers. "Drummond told me your girl stole from him. A debtor's daughter who ran with collateral. Simple enough. But there are things that do not fit." "Like what?" Pike was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He knows things about her father's death that a creditor should not know. The room where it happened, the window being open, the angle. He talks about these details like a man who was there, not like a man who read a report." The words settled into the air between them like dust after a gunshot. Adam did not fully understand what Pike was implying. But the shape of it was there, dark and terrible, at the edge of his comprehension. "What are you saying?" Adam asked. "I am saying that I ask questions for a living, and the answers I am getting do not match the story I was told. That is all I am saying, for now." Pike dropped the stone into the river and walked away up the bank. At the top, he turned back. "You love that girl," he said. It was not a question. Adam did not answer. "Then protect her, because what is coming is worse than a debt collector." Adam returned to the boarding house and found Meredith in the kitchen, kneading bread with a fury that turned the dough into something closer to punishment than baking. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the fear she was trying to bury under physical work. "Pike sent the ring to Drummond 3 days ago," Adam said. "He is on his way, probably a week out." The color drained from Meredith's face. She stopped kneading. Flour dust settled in the still air. "I should have run last night," she said. "Running is over, Meredith. I'm going to help you end this." "Why?" Her voice cracked on the word. "Why do you care this much about a woman you have known for 2 months?" Adam stepped closer, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel his presence the way you feel heat from a fire. "Because you wash your dress every night and put it on wet every morning, and you never complain. Because you feed stray dogs and talk to your tomato plants and sew stitches so small I need a lamp to see them. Because you carried a split tomato home from the dirt. Because you could not afford to waste it. Because I have been falling in love with you since the day I watched you hang that dress on the clothesline, and I will not, let someone take you away from the life you are building." The kitchen was very quiet. Steam rose from the pot on the stove. Flour hung in the air like dust in a sunbeam. Then Meredith reached out and took his hand, the first time she had voluntarily reached for him. She lifted his hand and placed it against her cheek. Her skin was warm, and her eyes were closed, and she did not say a word, because some things did not need words. They stood like that for a long time in the flour-dusted kitchen, while the bread dough waited and the world outside went about its business of being dangerous and beautiful and indifferent. That evening, Meredith went out to the clothesline. She hung her dress on the rope. The blue calico, faded and mended and thin as hope, swayed in the evening breeze. She was staying. But as she pinned the last corner of the fabric, she looked up and saw something in the distance. Dust on the eastern road. A lot of dust. Too much for one rider. Drummond was early. Drummond did not ride into Miles City the way other men did. He arrived in a black lacquered coach with a driver in a pressed suit and 2 gunmen flanking on horseback like pallbearers, as though he were carrying the entire weight of Eastern money into the grasslands and expected the West to kneel. He reached town on a Thursday afternoon, 6 days ahead of schedule. Adam watched from the livery as the coach rolled down Main Street, its polished sides catching the autumn sun. People stopped on the boardwalk to stare. Miles City did not see many coaches. It was a horse and wagon town, rough and practical, and this gleaming black vehicle looked as out of place as a diamond in a spittoon. Drummond stepped out in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. He was smaller than Adam had expected. Thin, narrow-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit with a gold watch chain. His face was clean-shaven and unremarkable except for the eyes. They were pale blue, and they moved across the street with the slow, calculating sweep of a man appraising property. Within 2 hours, Drummond had taken over the upper floor of the Silver Dollar and begun purchasing the town. He paid off 2 ranchers' overdue supply bills at Whitmore's store. He donated $50 to the church building fund. He bought the sheriff a steak dinner and a bottle of imported whiskey. He was building a story, brick by brick, the story of a generous Eastern businessman who had come west to settle a small matter and meant no harm to anyone. Adam watched all of this from a distance and felt the walls closing in. Drummond came to the boarding house the next morning. He arrived without his gunman, wearing a freshly pressed coat, his hat in his hands, his voice pitched low and sincere. He stood in the dining room where breakfast was being served and addressed Meredith as though they were old acquaintances reuniting after a pleasant separation. "Meredith, dear girl, it has been too long. Your father left certain obligations, as I am sure you remember, and I have come to settle them in a way that is fair to everyone. All I need is your signature on a few documents." Meredith stood behind the kitchen counter. In her right hand was a bread knife. She did not raise it or brandish it. She simply held it, the way a person holds something solid when the ground is moving beneath their feet. She said nothing. Clara Henderson stepped between them, all 5 feet and 2 inches of her, gray-haired and rigid with fury. "Miss Baker has no business with you, sir. I will ask you to leave my establishment." Drummond smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that had been used to close deals and foreclose on homes and convince judges to look the other way. "Of course, I meant no intrusion. But the law is the law, Mrs. Henderson. I will be at the Silver Dollar whenever Miss Baker is ready to be reasonable." He put his hat back on and walked out. The dining room was silent except for the sound of forks on plates and the ticking of Clara's mantel clock. That evening, Clara Henderson did something she had never done in 10 years of widowhood. She went to the Silver Dollar saloon, walked upstairs past the hired guns who watched her with mild surprise, and confronted Silas Drummond in his rented parlor. "You think I do not know who you are?" Clara said. She stood in the doorway and did not enter because entering would suggest she was asking permission. "Your man Hargrove killed my husband, Thomas Henderson, over 40 acres of grazing land 10 years ago. Shot him in the back and called it a dispute. I have been silent about it because I was afraid. I am not afraid anymore." Drummond set down his glass. "Mrs. Henderson, I am sorry for your loss, but I have no connection to any land dispute in Montana territory. Hargrove is your business partner. He acts on your orders. And whatever you're planning for that girl, you will have to go through me to get to her, and I am a woman with very little left to lose." Drummond's composure cracked just slightly, just enough for Clara to see the real man beneath the surface. His jaw tightened. His pale eyes went flat. "The Whitfield girl owes a legitimate debt," he said. "Her father died in his own study with the window open. What kind of man does that? A coward, a debtor who could not face his obligations." Clara went still. She heard the words clearly, and she heard what lived between them. How does a Philadelphia moneylender know the window was open? He would know if the police report mentioned it. But police reports did not mention open windows. They mentioned manner of death and weapon and position of the body. An open window was the kind of detail that mattered only to someone who had been in the room. She filed this away. She said nothing more. She turned and walked back down the stairs and across the street to her boarding house, where she found Adam on the porch and told him what Drummond had said. "He knew about the window," she said. "Henry Whitfield's study window was open the night he died. Meredith told me that months ago. Her father never opened windows, and Drummond mentioned it tonight like it was common knowledge. But it is not common knowledge. It is the kind of thing only a person who was there would know." Adam felt something cold settle in his stomach. That same night, one of Drummond's hired guns found Adam outside the livery stable. The man was big, thick through the chest and arms, with a revolver on each hip and the easy confidence of someone who had used them before. "Drummond sends a message," the gunman said. "Stay away from the Baker girl. This is not your affair. And if I do not, then it becomes your affair, and affairs with Mr. Drummond tend to end poorly." Adam's hands balled into fists. The old fire was there, hot and immediate, surging up from the place where he kept it locked. The gunman saw it and smiled. "Go ahead, cowboy. Give me a reason." Adam stood very still. The fists stayed clenched. His jaw ached from the pressure of his teeth. Every muscle in his body screamed to let go, to swing, to fight, to do the one thing he had always been good at. He thought about Meredith. He thought about the shirt she was making him, the careful stitches, The chambray fabric cut to his measurements, with hands that were steady and precise and kind. He thought about what she would think of him if he came to her with bloody knuckles and a split lip, and the wild eyes of a man who had let the chains slip. He unclenched his fists. He turned around. He walked away. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than pulling a trigger in Kansas, harder than 8 years of running, choosing not to fight when his whole body begged for it. That was the real courage, not the violence. The restraint. Late that night, a knock came at the livery door where Adam was sleeping in the hay beside his horse. He reached for the rifle he kept nearby and said, "Who is it?" "Pike." Adam opened the door. Pike stood in the moonlight, thin and dark and carrying a leather satchel. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was not sure he liked it. "Can we talk?" Pike said. They sat on hay bales in the lantern light, and Pike laid out what he had found. He had been writing letters for weeks, checking records, pulling threads. "The promissory note is forged," Pike said. He produced the document and pointed to the signatures. "Meredith's name is written in a different hand than her father's. The ink does not match. And see this notary stamp? This office closed 2 years before the note was supposedly signed. The seal is genuine, but the date is impossible." Adam studied the document. Even with his limited knowledge of legal papers, he could see the inconsistencies Pike was pointing out. "There is more," Pike said. He pulled a letter from the satchel. "I intercepted this from Drummond's outgoing post, written to Hargrove, dated 3 months ago." Adam read the relevant passage aloud. "The Whitfield matter was handled cleanly. No one questions the coroner's findings." He read it again. "Handled. You did not use that word for a suicide. You used that word for a job, something that was arranged, something that was done." "He killed her father," Adam said. "I cannot prove it from here," Pike said. "But that letter, combined with the forged note, combined with what he said to Mrs. Henderson about the window, it paints a picture, and it is not the picture of a creditor collecting a debt." Pike placed the forged note, the letter, and one more item on the hay bale between them. A diamond ring. Modest, a single stone in a gold band. "I stole it back from his coat while he slept," Pike said. "It was in his breast pocket." Adam looked at the 3 items. Evidence. Not enough for a murder conviction, maybe, but enough to destroy the story Drummond was selling to Miles City. Enough to shift the balance. "Why?" Adam asked. "You were hired to find her. You did your job. Why turn on your client?" Pike was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I have a code. I do not harm women. I do not work for liars. And I finish every job I start." He paused. "2 of those things are now in conflict. Drummond lied to me about the nature of this job. The girl did not steal from him. She ran from a man who murdered her father and forged documents to claim her as property. I cannot finish a job built on that." He stood and picked up the satchel. "I am leaving tonight. My contract is void. What you do with the evidence is your business." He walked to the livery door, then stopped. "I left something on her windowsill. A $5 bill and a note. For the dog." Then he was gone. A lean, dark figure dissolving into the Montana night. Adam sat with the evidence in his hands and felt the weight of what was coming. He had to tell Meredith. He had to show her the letter. And when he did, the locked room in her mind, the one where she kept the details about her father's death that did not fit, was going to open. He found her in the kitchen of the boarding house because Meredith was always in the kitchen when she was afraid. She was mixing something in a bowl with mechanical intensity, her hands coated in flour, her face blank. "I need to show you something," Adam said. He placed the letter on the kitchen table. She read it with her lips moving slightly, the way people read when the words are too important to process silently. The Whitfield matter was handled cleanly. No one questions the coroner's findings. She read it twice. Then she set the letter down very carefully as though it might explode if she moved too fast. "The window," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "What about the window?" "My father's study window was open the night he died. He never opened windows, never. He was terrified of drafts. Everyone who knew him knew that." Meredith. His glasses were on the wrong side of the desk, left side. He always put them on the right. Always. For 20 years. Meredith. The suicide note was written in black ink. My father only used blue ink. He was particular about it. She looked up from the letter and her face was transformed. The fear was gone. The wariness was gone. In their place was something harder and older and more dangerous than either. "He killed my father," she said. "Drummond murdered him and made it look like despair. And then he came for me." Adam placed the ring on the table beside the letter. Then the forged promissory note. 3 pieces of evidence. 3 reasons to stop running. Meredith picked up the ring and held it in her palm. Her mother's ring. The last piece of her old life. She looked at Adam with eyes like flint. "I am not running," she said. "And I am not hiding. I am going to stand in front of this town and tell them exactly what Silas Drummond is. You do not have to do this alone." "I know," she said. "That is why I am choosing to." Meredith Whitfield put on her blue calico dress for the last time on a Tuesday morning in November. She did not wash it the night before. She did not press it or mend it or worry about the wrinkles. She put it on the way a soldier puts on armor, not for beauty, but for purpose. She was done hiding behind borrowed names. She was done running from shadows. She was going to walk into the dining room of Henderson's boarding house and destroy the man who had murdered her father. The preparation had taken 2 days. Adam and Clara and Jack Harlan had worked together, sending messages, making arrangements. The sheriff had been invited. The preacher. 4 respected ranchers. Whitmore from the general store. Every person of standing in Miles City who could serve as witness and jury. Drummond had been invited too. The message, delivered by Jack with exaggerated politeness, said that Miss Baker wished to discuss terms. Drummond had accepted immediately because he believed he had won. A woman alone with a forged debt and no allies. What threat could she possibly pose? At 9 in the morning, the dining room of Henderson's boarding house was full. 20 people seated at the long tables, coffee cups in hand, faces curious and expectant. Drummond sat at the head of the center table, flanked by his 2 hired guns, a smile on his thin face. Adam stood near the kitchen door. Jack Harlan stood near the front entrance. 4 cowboys from the Double J were positioned at various exits, each carrying a Winchester with the casual ease of men who used them every day. The arrangement was not accidental. If Drummond's men reached for their weapons, they would find themselves outflanked and outgunned. Clara Henderson stood behind the serving counter, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her face like granite. Then Meredith walked in. She walked to the head of the room and stood where everyone could see her. The blue calico dress, faded and mended, hung on her thin frame like a flag that had been through a war. She held a stack of papers in her hands. Her fingers were white at the knuckles. "My name," she said, "is not Meredith Baker." The room went quiet. "My name is Meredith Whitfield. I am the daughter of Henry Whitfield, a merchant of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 2 years ago, I fled my home under a false name because the man sitting at that table murdered my father and tried to claim me as his property." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to hold its breath. Drummond's smile disappeared. He started to stand. "This is outrageous. The girl is delusional and a thief. She stole property and fled her legal obligations, and now she is telling lies to avoid consequence." "Then you will not mind explaining this." Meredith held up the promissory note. "This document claims I co-signed my father's debt. But this is not my handwriting. It is not my father's handwriting either. I have letters written by my father, which I will pass around for comparison. And the notary's stamp on this note is from an office that closed 2 years before the document was supposedly signed. She passed the forged note and her father's letters to the sheriff, who studied them with the slow, careful attention of a man who took his authority seriously. I also have this. She held up Drummond's letter to Hargrove. Written by Mr. Drummond to his business partner, Mr. Hargrove, who several of you know as the man who owns half the buildings on 2nd Street. The relevant passage reads as follows. She read it aloud. Her voice did not shake. The Whitfield matter was handled cleanly. No one questions the coroner's findings. She let the words settle. Then she continued. My father was found dead in his study on March the 14th, 1880. The coroner ruled it self-infliction, but there were details that did not fit. My father's window was open. He feared drafts his entire life. He never opened windows. His reading glasses were on the wrong side of the desk. The note on his desk was written in an ink he never used. She turned to Drummond, who had gone the color of old ash. And 2 days ago, Mr. Drummond, you said something to Mrs. Henderson that you should not have known. You mentioned that my father died with the window open. How would a creditor in Philadelphia know about an open window in a dead man's study? The police report does not mention windows. The coroner's report does not mention windows. The only way you could know about that window is if you were in the room when he died. The silence pressed down on the room like a physical weight. Drummond stood. His face was rigid and his thin hands gripped the edge of the table. This is slander. This is the desperate invention of a thieving girl and a cowboy who does not even use his real name. He turned to the room, to the sheriff, to the ranchers, to everyone who was watching. You want truth? Here is truth. The man protecting this girl, your righteous cowboy Adam Thompson, is Adam Calloway of Ellis County, Kansas. Wanted for the murder of James Garrett, the younger, 8 years ago. He is a killer hiding behind a false name. And you are taking his word and this woman's word over mine. Every eye in the room moved to Adam. Meredith turned to look at him. He could see it on her face. The shock, the hurt, the instant recalculation. She had trusted him. She had held his hand in the dark. She had placed his hand against her cheek. And he had been hiding the same kind of secret she had been hiding. The hypocrisy of it hit her visibly, like a blow. Adam stood up slowly. The room was silent. Drummond was smiling again, the smile of a man who believed he had found the winning card. My name is Adam Calloway, Adam said. His voice was steady. His hands were at his sides. 8 years ago in Kansas, I shot a man named James Garrett, the younger, during a cattle dispute. He drew first. There were witnesses. But the Garrett family owned the local sheriff and bought the court, and I ran because running was the only option I had. He paused, looked at Meredith. I am not proud of running, but I am not a murderer. I am a man who defended his own life and then spent 8 years being afraid to live it. Another pause. Longer this time. I should have told you, he said directly to Meredith. I wanted to. I ran out of time. That is not an excuse. It is a fact, and I am sorry. The room held its breath. Meredith looked at Adam for a long time. The hurt was there on her face, plain as a brand. But something else was there, too. Something that moved beneath the hurt like water under ice. Then she turned back to Drummond. Adam Calloway defended himself against a man with a gun, she said. You murdered my father in his study and made it look like despair. One of these men has blood on his hands, the other has blood on his conscience. And they are not the same man. From the doorway came a voice, small but clear. I have something to say. Eleanor Price stepped into the room. She was pale, and her hands were trembling, but her chin was up and her eyes were fixed on the sheriff. Mr. Drummond, through his partner Hargrove, threatened my business unless I spied on Miss Baker. Miss Whitfield. He paid me to confirm her identity and report her movements. I took the money because I was afraid of losing my shop. I am not proud of it. But I have dates and amounts and specific instructions, and I will swear to all of it." Drummond's face went from ash to red. He turned on Eleanor with the viciousness of a cornered animal. "You ungrateful little traitor, I will destroy you." "You already have," Eleanor said quietly. "That is why I have nothing left to lose." The sheriff stood. He was a tall man named Rollins, not given to drama, and he had been studying the documents during the entire exchange. He placed the forged promissory note and Drummond's letter side by side on the table. "Mr. Drummond," he said, "I am placing you under arrest on charges of forgery, conspiracy, and fraud. This letter regarding Mr. Whitfield's death will be forwarded to the authorities in Philadelphia for investigation. You will be held in the territorial jail here in Miles City, pending arraignment and transport to the territorial prison at Deer Lodge." Drummond's hired guns assessed the room. 5 cowboys with Winchesters at every exit. Jack Harlan, grinning in a way that held no humor at all, with his rifle laid across his knees. The mathematics were clear. The hired guns stood up slowly, unbuckled their gun belts, and set them on the table. Drummond was taken out of the boarding house in irons. He did not go quietly. He shouted threats and promises of legal retribution and invocations of powerful friends in Philadelphia. But the door closed behind him and his voice faded into the morning air, and the room let out a collective breath. People began to stand and move and murmur. The sheriff gathered the evidence. The preacher shook his head. The ranchers looked at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to satisfaction. And in the midst of all of it, Meredith and Adam stood on opposite sides of the room, separated by 15 feet of wooden floor and one enormous secret. The room emptied. Clara ushered the last of the witnesses out. Jack Harlan caught Adam's eye, tipped his hat, and left with his cowboys. The boarding house was quiet. Meredith had not spoken to Adam directly since his confession. The silence between them was vast and heavy, filled with all the things they both wanted to say and could not. Then Meredith walked across the room. She stopped in front of him. She placed her hand on his chest over his heart, which was hammering so hard she could feel it through the fabric of his shirt. "You did not run," she said. "I will not," Adam said. "Not ever again. I am angry with you. I know. I am going to be angry for a while. I know that too. But I am not leaving, and neither are you." She did not kiss him, not yet. She turned and walked into the kitchen, and through the closed door Adam heard her begin to cry. Not the quiet tears of the clothesline, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place so far down inside her that they shook her whole body. Crying for her father, for the truth she finally knew, for 2 years of running that were over, for the relief and the rage and the grief that had been dammed up behind walls she could not maintain any longer. Adam sat down on the porch steps. The morning sun was warm on his face. He could hear Meredith crying inside, and he did not go to her because she needed to do this alone, but he stayed. He sat on those steps, and he waited. He would wait as long as she needed. Late that night, when the boarding house was dark and the town was silent, Adam found a brown paper package on the porch where he had been sitting. Inside was a shirt, blue chambray, every stitch perfect, every seam precise. A note was pinned to the collar in Meredith's careful handwriting. The first shirt for the man who stayed. She had signed it with just her initial. M. Spring came to Miles City early that year, as if Montana itself wanted a fresh start. The drought broke with October rains that turned the Tongue River brown and full and loud. November brought the first snow, heavy and silent, blanketing the prairie in white and driving everyone indoors. December was bitter. January was worse. The kind of cold that froze water in the pitcher and cracked the chinking between logs and made every trip to the outhouse feel like an expedition into enemy territory. But spring, when it came gently. The snow melted in long, slow days of warming sun. The creek on Adam's 20 acres ran high with snowmelt, clear and cold. Willows along the bank put out the first green buds. The prairie grass came back, thin at first, then thicker, spreading like a rumor until the land was green from horizon to horizon. Adam had purchased the 20 acres in February, using savings he had accumulated over 2 years of careful work. The price was fair. The land was good. A creek for water, a stand of pine to the north for timber and windbreak, and an east-facing slope that caught the morning sun. He spent every spare hour on the property, felling trees, preparing lumber, laying a foundation for the cabin he would build. The Kansas matter resolved itself by letter. Adam had written to the new sheriff of Ellis County, a man named Dawson who had replaced the corrupt lawman the Garrett family had owned. Adam gave his account, named the witnesses, and waited. The response came in March. The case had been reviewed. Witnesses confirmed that James Garrett, the younger, had drawn first. The shooting was ruled self-defense. The warrant against Adam Calloway was rescinded. But there was a second letter in the envelope. Separate. Different handwriting. It was from Sarah Garrett, the dead man's sister. Adam read it sitting alone on a fallen log by the creek on his property, with the spring sun on his face and the sound of moving water all around him. Mr. Calloway, the letter said, I want you to know that my brother drew first. My father knew it. He spent the rest of his life knowing it, and it ate him from the inside out. He died last winter, still knowing it. I do not forgive you because forgiveness is not mine to give, for I was not there and I did not see. But the truth is the truth, and someone should have said it 8 years ago. Adam read the letter 3 times. He folded it and placed it in his shirt pocket next to his heart. He sat on that log for a long time, listening to the creek and feeling something loosen in his chest that had been clenched for 8 years. He kept the name Thompson. Calloway was a boy who ran. Thompson was the man who stopped. His relationship with Meredith mended slowly, the way broken bones mend, stronger in the place where the break was, but aching in cold weather. She was angry with him for weeks after Drummond's arrest, not for his past, for the secret. She had given him her trust, the most precious thing she possessed, and he had withheld the one truth that mattered most. They did not walk together for a month. They passed each other at the boarding house and exchanged polite words that meant nothing. Clara Henderson watched them with the impatient expression of a woman who had seen this before and knew it would work itself out if the principals had the sense God gave a fence post. The thaw came in small steps, a conversation through the kitchen window. Adam asking about her garden plans for spring. Meredith answering with more than one syllable. A shared silence on the porch one Sunday afternoon, sitting 3 feet apart, not talking. Just being in the same space and allowing it. Then, the first walk after the snow melted. Along the Tongue River, on the same path they had walked in August, under the same cottonwoods that were now putting out their spring leaves. They walked slowly, carefully, both choosing each step like people crossing thin ice. I understand why you hid it, Meredith said. I hid the same kind of thing for the same kind of reason. I changed my name, and I lied about my past, and I kept everyone at arm's length, because I was afraid that the truth would destroy whatever small safety I had built. I should have told you sooner. Yes, you should have. I was afraid. I know. So was I. She stopped walking and turned to face him. But if we are going to build anything, Adam, there cannot be locked rooms between us. Not ever again. I need to know that the man I am standing beside is the man he says he is. All of him, even the parts he's ashamed of. Not ever again, Adam said. I promise. They walked on. The river ran high beside them, brown with snowmelt. And the prairie was green, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark was singing the way meadowlarks sing in spring, as though the whole world were brand new and worth celebrating. Over the winter, Meredith had finished all 3 chambray shirts. Adam wore the first one every Sunday, the second for ranch work, and the third he kept folded in his trunk without explanation. And from the remaining fabric, the generous 17 yards that they had both always known were more than 3 shirts required, Meredith had made 2 dresses, navy blue, simply styled, well-fitted. Not fancy, not Philadelphia fashion, but clean and new and hers. For the first time in over 2 years, she had a choice about what to wear each morning. The narration of her life no longer read one dress, one dress, one dress, one dress. It read something different now. It read possibility. She stood in her room at the boarding house one April morning and looked at 3 garments hanging on pegs on the wall. The old blue calico, faded and mended. The navy chambray dress, new and sturdy. And the second chambray dress, cut in a slightly different style. 3 options. 3 versions of herself she could choose to be on any given day. She stood there for a full minute, just deciding, the luxury of it, the simple, extraordinary luxury of deciding what to wear. She chose the navy dress, then she changed her mind and put on the calico, not because she had to, because she wanted to, because wearing it was no longer a sentence, it was a choice. On a Sunday afternoon in April of 1883, Adam led Meredith to his 20 acres. He had been working on the land for months, and the cabin's foundation was laid, the first walls framed. It was not a house yet. It was the skeleton of a house, raw timber and promise. Meredith stood in the clearing and turned in a slow circle. The creek ran clear and cold to the east. The pine stand rose dark green to the north. The slope faced east, which meant the morning sun would pour through windows that were not yet built into a room that was not yet finished for a life that was not yet started. "It is perfect," she whispered. "It will be," Adam said. "Once we build the house and plant your garden and fill it with all the noise and mess of living." Meredith looked at him. "We?" Adam stepped forward. He did not kneel. He stood facing her and took both of her hands in his. Her hands were work-hardened and pin-scarred and strong, and they fit in his like they had been made for the purpose. "I do not have a diamond ring," he said. "I know your mother's ring is in that tin box under your bed and it belongs to you, and I would never presume to use it. What I have is 20 acres, 3 shirts you sewed, and a heart that does not know how to be scared of anything except losing you." He felt her hands tighten in his. "Meredith Whitfield, Meredith Baker, Meredith whatever name you choose. Will you build a life with me?" She looked down at their joined hands, hers rough and his rougher, both of them carrying the evidence of hard lives and harder choices, both of them scarred by the past they had survived. She looked up. Her creek water eyes were full of light. "My name will be Meredith Thompson," she said. And yes, they were married on the 20th of April, 1883, in the small church in Miles City. Clara Henderson cried openly and without apology. Jack Harlan's toast was twice as long as the preacher's sermon and 3 times as funny. Eleanor Price, who had lost her shop after testifying against Drummond but had found work doing alterations from Clara's parlor, brought a bolt of white ribbon as a gift. Meredith wore a dress of cream-colored muslin she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar that Clara had contributed from her own wedding dress, decades old and carefully preserved. Adam wore the 3rd chambray shirt, the one he had saved, and when Meredith saw it, she laughed and cried at the same time. "You saved it," she said. "I saved it," he confirmed. "I knew what it was for the moment you handed me the first one." The preacher kept the ceremony short. Adam's hands shook only a little when he slipped a plain gold band onto Meredith's finger. She had bought it herself with her own savings because she would not let him buy his own wedding ring and hers too. They were partners. They would start as they meant to go on. "I love you," he whispered as they were pronounced husband and wife. "Forever," she whispered back. They moved into the half-finished cabin the next day. It was small, 2 rooms and a loft with walls that still smelled of fresh-cut pine. But it was solid, and it was warm, and it was theirs. Meredith hung curtains she had sewn and planted her garden in the rich soil near the creek, talking to the seeds as she pressed them into the earth. Adam worked from dawn to dusk, building fences, digging a well, preparing for the small herd he would buy in the fall. Word came from Philadelphia in June. The authorities had investigated Drummond's letter and the circumstances of Henry Whitfield's death. The case was reopened. 2 witnesses came forward who had been afraid to speak while Drummond was free. The coroner recanted his findings under oath. Drummond, already serving time in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge for forgery and conspiracy, was indicted for murder by the state of Pennsylvania. He would be extradited east to stand trial. Meredith received the news sitting on the porch of her cabin with the evening sun on her face. She read the letter, folded it carefully, and looked out at the garden and the creek and the wide Montana sky. "It will not bring him back," she said. "No," Adam agreed, "but he will answer for it. My father will have justice. He will." She leaned against Adam's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together on the porch of the house they were building, in the life they were making, on the land they had chosen. 2 people who had started with nothing but determination and the stubborn refusal to let the world break them. 1 year later. Meredith was hanging laundry behind the cabin. The afternoon light was gold, the kind of light that only Montana produced, warm and slanting and edged with the faintest chill of the mountains to the west. The creek ran clear, chattering over stones. A yellow dog, pup of a neighbor's litter, not the one they had lost, but carrying the same stubborn sweetness in its bones, lay belly up on the porch with its paws in the air. The clothesline stretched between 2 posts that Adam had set in concrete, because he had learned that Meredith's clothesline was not just a clothesline. It was a measure of how far they had come. 5 dresses hung on the line. Blue chambray, the first one she made from the leftover fabric. Gray cotton, purchased with her own money from her vegetable sales in town. Green calico, a gift from Clara for Christmas. Cream muslin, her wedding dress, washed and worn for special occasions. And the old blue calico, faded and mended and soft as memory, the dress that had started everything. 5 dresses catching the Montana wind. 5 colors of a life that had room in it for choices. Adam rode in from the east pasture on the bay gelding he had bought in the fall. He reined up at the fence and sat for a moment watching the clothesline. Meredith turned, a wooden pin in her hand, and saw him there. She smiled. "What are you looking at?" Adam did not answer right away. He looked at the 5 dresses moving in the wind. He looked at the cabin behind them, smoke drifting from the chimney. He looked at the garden, green and full, tomatoes and beans and squash growing in the rich creek-bottom soil. He looked at the yellow dog asleep on the porch. He looked at Meredith, standing in the afternoon light in her old blue calico, the one she still wore for gardening, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Her dark hair was loose on her shoulders, and her hands were dirty from the garden, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Your clothesline," he said. His voice was rough. "What about it?" A long pause. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The dresses swayed on the line. "There is more than one. More than—" Meredith looked at the clothesline, at the 5 dresses, at the colors, at what they meant. Then she looked back at Adam, sitting on his horse in the golden light, and she did not explain what it meant, because he already knew, and she already knew, and some things did not need language. She reached up and touched the old blue calico where it hung on the line. The fabric was thin enough to see light through. The hem had been mended a dozen times. The color had faded from sky blue to something closer to morning fog. She wore it because she chose to. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. Not the dress, not the fabric, not even the help Adam had given her. The choice, the beautiful, hard-won, irreplaceable right to decide for herself. The wind lifted the old calico higher on the line, higher than the others. The faded blue fabric caught the light, and for just a moment, just one breath of Montana wind, it looked like it might fly. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives. and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.